The air inside the courtroom felt stale, heavy with the scent of varnished wood and tension. Eli Morgan, 17th, stood trembling in the witness box, his voice catching as he tried to explain the missing wallet that had never touched his hands. Daniel Crane, 39, prowled like a wolf circling prey, each interruption striking harder than the last. The murmuring gallery fed his arrogance, while Judge Harriet Cole, 58, tapped her pen like a metronome of impatience. When Crane mocked Ellie's nervous pauses, calling him deceitful, something within the boy wilted, until the door creaked open. Every head turned. Captain Samuel Morgan, 46, stood framed by light, his medals burning gold against his uniform. The silence that followed wasn't commanded, it was earned. Crane's smirk withered, the judge straightened, and Eli felt the tremor of dignity return. Justice hadn't yet spoken, but it had entered the room. The echo of boots against marble echoed like a slow drumbeat of reckoning. Captain Morgan walked down the aisle, every step peeling arrogance off the prosecutor's face. The courtroom's hum died into breathless respect as his uniform, crisp and proud, caught glints of light that danced across the oak panels. Eli stood taller, the shame in his eyes replaced by a flicker of hope. Judge Cole lowered her gaze, recalling the flag that hung above her bench and what it was meant to stand for. Daniel Crane straightened his tie, forcing a smirk that no longer fit. The captain's calm voice filled the silence. He hadn't come to defend his son through words, but through presence. And that presence made everyone remember what truth feels like when it finally enters a room built on procedure. Maria Reyes, 34, the weary but sharp-eyed public defender, rose with a quiet strength. Her voice trembled only for a heartbeat before settling into measured conviction. Your Honor, before the prosecutor continues, perhaps the court should remember this boy's right to speak. Her words hung in the still air like truth rediscovered. Crane's smirk returned, brittle this time. He turned to Captain Morgan, trying to diminish him with charm, disguised as civility, but the captain didn't blink. The judge, gaze drifted from the father to the son, 2 generations standing against a polished machine of pride. Silence again, not from fear, but from the realization that the scales had shifted. Crane returned to his lectern, voice lowered but laced with venom. So, the captain thinks his son deserves special treatment? His tone drew a murmur from the gallery. Captain Morgan didn't answer. He simply turned his gaze toward Eli, calm and unbroken. The only thing my son deserves, he finally said, is fairness, the same as anyone else. The words rippled through the courtroom like a sermon. Judge Cole looked down at her notes, the weight of justice pressing on her like a confession. For the first time, Crane hesitated before his next word. Truth had entered his courtroom, and it was staring him down. The first recess bell rang, but no one moved. The tension refused to break. Eli turned to his father, whispering, "You didn't have to come." Captain Morgan placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and grounding. "I always come when justice forgets its duty." The words hit deeper than any verdict. Maria Reyes smiled faintly, recognizing a strength she had long fought to see in her clients. Judge Cole exhaled, realizing she had just witnessed something purer than procedure: integrity. Crane, left standing alone, adjusted his cufflinks and stared at the uniform that had silenced him. Act 1 closed, not with applause, but with respect. An awakening. The gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. The courtroom reconvened, air thick with unspoken challenge. Daniel Crane, 39, had recovered his mask of confidence, but the edge in his tone betrayed unease. Across from him sat Captain Samuel Morgan, 46, still in uniform, eyes steady like steel. Eli Morgan, 17th, now watched with quiet awareness, the fear from earlier replaced by something deeper: resolve. Maria Reyes, 34, leaned in close, whispering a few measured words before standing to address the court. "The defense calls Captain Morgan." The silence was instantaneous. As the captain took the stand, metals glinting under the soft amber lights, Crane smirked faintly, ready to strike again. Yet, there was no tremor in the captain's voice, no weakness in his presence. His first sentence cut through the air. "My son has been taught that courage is silent until it must speak. Today, it speaks." Crane approached with a predatory calm, pretending respect while sharpening his tone with each question. "Captain, surely your uniform doesn't exempt your son from the law." The captain didn't flinch. "No one is above it, least of all me." The gallery stirred. Crane pressed harder, throwing insinuations, weaving traps with polished rhetoric, but every attempt met a wall of poise. Judge Cole leaned back, chin resting on her hand, studying not the words but the posture of integrity before her. Eli clenched his fists beneath the table, watching his father dismantle arrogance with silence. By the time Crane paused, the air was heavier than when the trial began, not with hostility, but with the quiet humiliation of power unmasked. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with whispers. Reporters scribbled notes. Cameras clicked like impatient insects. Eli leaned against the cold marble wall beside Maria Reyes, head low. "They think I'm just some kid?" he muttered. She looked at him with weary affection. "They thought that about every person who ever stood against power." Down the corridor, Captain Morgan spoke quietly with another veteran, his old comrade Major Lewis, 50, who had come to show support. Their exchange was short, but the look between them spoke volumes. Soldiers understood justice in blood and scars, not paperwork. As the doors opened for the next session, Eli inhaled deeply. Stepping forward into the fire he no longer feared. Back inside, Judge Cole announced a surprise: the introduction of a new witness, the store owner who had accused Eli of theft. Gordon Pike, 55, a stout man with a habit of shifting blame. Crane smiled thinly. This was his moment to regain control. Pike's testimony began with confidence, but soon wavered as Maria Reyes cross-examined him. Her calm, deliberate questions exposed inconsistencies like cracks in glass. "You said you saw Eli take the wallet? From which side of the counter?" she asked. Pike stammered. "The left, I think." The courtroom watched, spellbound, as his certainty dissolved. Captain Morgan's eyes narrowed, not with vengeance, but pity. The truth was close, and it terrified those who had built walls to contain it. As the day drew to its end, tension clung to every surface. Crane gathered his papers with forced composure, masking frustration that simmered beneath his skin. Eli stood by the defense table, glancing once more at his father. "How do you stay so calm?" he asked quietly. Captain Morgan's answer came like a soft command. "Because truth doesn't tremble, son. Only lies do." That sentence settled over the room like sacred dust. Judge Cole adjourned court for the evening, but before the gavel struck, she looked at Eli, not as a defendant, but as a boy fighting to be heard. The doors closed, and in that fading echo, justice itself seemed to be preparing for the reckoning ahead. Morning light spilled through the courthouse windows, but it did nothing to ease the tension that hung like fog. The trial had shifted, no longer a question of theft, but of character. Daniel Crane, 39, entered early, his once slick confidence showing cracks beneath the surface. Across the room, Eli Morgan, 17th, sat beside Maria Reyes, 34, their eyes fixed on Captain Samuel Morgan, 46, who stood silently by the defense table polishing his service medal as if reminding the court of the values it had forgotten. Judge Harriet Cole, 58, took her seat and sensed it. Today would draw blood, though not the kind anyone could see. When Crane began his questioning, he no longer sounded powerful, only desperate. "Captain, are you saying your son has never lied?" he asked, leaning forward. The captain's answer was soft but cutting. "I'm saying he's never lied to protect himself from truth. Can you say the same?" The tension snapped when Crane raised his voice. "You think your service makes you untouchable?" he shouted. The courtroom gasped. Judge Cole's gavel struck sharply, echoing through the chamber like thunder. But Captain Morgan didn't flinch. Instead, he rose slowly from the witness chair. "No," he said, his tone grave and steady. "My service taught me that men who shout in place of reason are already defeated." The silence that followed was suffocating. Eli's heart pounded in pride, his eyes burning with both admiration and fear for his father's boldness. Maria Reyes exhaled quietly. This was no longer just a trial. It was a reckoning. Crane's composure shattered. His pen slipped from his hand and hit the table with a small, almost pitiful sound that filled the room with meaning. During the recess, Crane sat alone in his office, blinds drawn. The mask had fallen. The walls that once held his confidence now pressed inward with the weight of guilt. On his desk lay a letter. A formal complaint against him, unsigned but clear in intent. He knew where it came from. Judge Cole had begun the paperwork. For years he had built his career on intimidation, cutting corners, bending truth. And now one boy and his father had done what no jury ever could. They made him look inward. Outside, he could hear reporters shouting, "Captain Morgan saves his son." The words stung, because deep down, Crane realized that the boy never needed saving. It was he who needed redemption. Back in the courtroom, Maria Reyes stood, ready for her most crucial cross-examination. Eli Morgan's name had been dragged through doubt long enough. Her voice carried calm power as she addressed the room. "This isn't about a wallet anymore. It's about what we choose to believe about those with less power than ourselves." The words echoed beyond the benches. Even Judge Cole seemed moved. Across the room, Captain Morgan nodded once, silent pride gleaming in his eyes. Crane sat still, face pale, the weight of truth pressing harder than any accusation. And for the first time, the audience, the same people who once whispered judgments, now leaned forward not to condemn, but to listen. As day turned to evening, a storm gathered outside, the first drops tapping against the courthouse glass. Inside, the final moments of the day's hearing unfolded. Crane stood once more, his voice subdued, his arrogance now gone. "Your Honor," he began. "The prosecution requests a brief recess." His tone lacked the venom it once carried. It was weary, almost human. Judge Cole nodded, granting it, but her eyes lingered on him, sensing the silent war within. Captain Morgan turned to Eli and whispered, "You're teaching him something today." Eli frowned softly. "Teaching who?" "The man who thought he knew justice," his father replied. The camera of emotion lingered there. A soldier, a boy, a fading prosecutor, and a judge, all suspended in the fragile balance of redemption. The storm outside grew heavier, its rumble weaving into the courtroom's silence as though the sky itself waited for truth to speak. Judge Harriet Cole, 58, entered first, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. Daniel Crane, 39, stood beside the prosecution table, his once polished appearance slightly disheveled, the fight within him dimming to something closer to regret. Eli Morgan, 17th, sat straight-backed beside Maria Reyes, 34, who exuded quiet strength. Captain Samuel Morgan, 46, remained at the end of the defense table, his uniform crisp despite the humidity, his stare resolute. When the judge called for the next witness, a murmur passed through the gallery. A young clerk entered, holding a file. Inside it lay the surveillance footage that the prosecution had failed to disclose. The video showed a different boy, not Eli, pocketing the wallet. Gasps filled the room, the storm thundered, and justice, for the first time, began to breathe. The courtroom buzzed with confusion as the footage replayed. Crane's voice faltered as he tried to recover, his pride collapsing under the weight of evidence. "There must be an error," he stammered. Maria Reyes rose, her tone cutting but calm. "No error, Your Honor. This footage was time-stamped and submitted to the police. The prosecution failed to present it. Gasps rippled through the crowd again. Judge Cole's jaw tightened. "Mr. Crane, were you aware of this evidence?" Silence. Only the sound of rain pounding glass. Eli turned toward his father, eyes shining not with victory, but disbelief. The captain gave one nod, his expression both proud and sorrowful. Justice had arrived, but not without exposing what had been broken along the way. When the gavel finally struck, it sounded less like a command and more like a lament. Judge Cole announced a short recess before issuing her ruling. As people dispersed, Crane approached Captain Morgan, his voice low, shaky. "I didn't mean to destroy him," he said. The captain's answer came without anger, "But you tried to win instead of seek truth. That's where justice dies." The words pierced through Crane more deeply than any reprimand. Eli stood beside his father, looking not at his enemy, but at a man undone by his own ambition. Maria Reyes gathered her notes silently, her expression a portrait of vindicated sorrow. Outside, the storm lightened, rain easing, clouds thinning, as if the world itself exhaled. As proceedings resumed, Judge Cole's voice carried the weight of moral reckoning. "This court has witnessed something rare. Not just innocence proved, but conscience awakened." Her gaze turned to Crane, who stood, head bowed. "The state will review this case and your conduct, Mr. Crane. For now, the charges against Eli Morgan are dismissed." The words landed like music wrapped in thunder. Eli's breath hitched, a single tear tracing down his cheek. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some in applause, some in stunned silence. Captain Morgan reached out, his hand resting on his son's shoulder, a soldier's gesture, precise and proud. Maria Reyes smiled faintly, eyes glistening. Justice had spoken, not loudly, but with grace. When the courtroom emptied, only 4 remained: Eli, his father, Maria Reyes, and Crane. The echoes of justice lingered like fading applause. Crane turned, voice trembling. "Captain, I'll resign. I don't deserve this seat." The captain shook his head slowly. "Resign if you wish, but redemption isn't resignation, it's responsibility." He extended his hand. After a long moment, Crane took it, eyes wet with something human at last. Eli looked at Maria Reyes, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "So, it's over." She nodded softly. "No, Eli, it's just beginning." Outside, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the courthouse glass, bathing them in a quiet glow, not of triumph, but of peace earned through truth. The courthouse stood quiet the next morning, its steps glistening from the night's rain. Eli Morgan, 17th, walked beside Captain Samuel Morgan, 46, both dressed simply now, without uniforms or ties, only themselves. The city around them seemed softer, humbled. Reporters called out questions, flashes from cameras slicing through the gray morning, but the captain didn't stop. "Justice isn't a story," he murmured to Eli. "It's a duty." Inside, Judge Harriet Cole, 58, signed the last page of the dismissal order, pausing for a moment as sunlight hit her face. Daniel Crane, 39, watched from the doorway, expression distant, his resignation letter folded in his hand. For the first time, there was no bitterness in his eyes, only quiet acceptance. Justice had not ruined him, it had revealed him. That evening, a small crowd gathered at the town's Veteran Memorial Park. Captain Morgan stood before them, not as a soldier, but as a father. Eli stood nearby, nervous but proud. The captain spoke gently, his voice carrying across the field. "Justice is not the silence of guilt, but the courage to stand when you're told to bow." The crowd listened, townspeople, veterans, even Maria Reyes, 34, who stood at the edge, smiling faintly. In the distance, Crane watched in plain clothes, unnoticed, his hands in his pockets, the wind tugging softly at his coat. Redemption doesn't ask for applause. It listens. Days later, Eli returned to school. The hallway fell silent as he walked in, not from mockery, but respect. The same classmates who had whispered rumors now parted to let him pass. Eli didn't gloat. He simply nodded and took his seat. Maria Reyes had arranged a civic lesson that morning about moral courage, and she invited him to speak. Standing before the class, he said softly, "When someone calls you guilty before hearing you, they're really afraid you might be innocent." The words struck deeper than any textbook could. Outside, through the window, a faint reflection of Captain Morgan appeared, waiting in the car, smiling faintly, his mission fulfilled. Meanwhile, Daniel Crane sat at his kitchen table, an untouched cup of coffee cooling beside him. On the wall hung a single framed photograph, his oath of office. For hours he stared at it before finally taking it down, placing it gently into a box. He didn't see the act as defeat, but as absolution. Later that day, he mailed an envelope to Eli Morgan containing a simple note. "The truth you carried saved me from the lies I lived by. Thank you." Across town, Eli read it in silence, folding it carefully and slipping it into his pocket, not as proof of victory, but as a promise to live by. At dusk, Captain Morgan and Eli stood on a bridge overlooking the city, the river below reflecting streaks of orange and violet light. "You know," the captain said, "the uniform doesn't make the man, truth does." Eli smiled softly. "You think people will remember what happened?" His father shook his head. "They don't have to, as long as you do." The camera lingered on their silhouettes against the fading horizon, father and son, soldier and boy, bound not by verdicts, but by virtue. Below, the current flowed steadily onward, as all stories of justice do, quiet, relentless, and eternal. Autumn crept into the city with long shadows and soft gold light. The courthouse steps, once crowded with chaos, now stood empty, a monument to what truth had conquered. Eli Morgan, 17th, walked there alone, tracing the marble grooves where cameras once flashed. His reflection merged with the flagpole above, fluttering faintly in the wind. Inside, Judge Harriet Cole, 58, sat in her chambers writing her final remarks for the judicial review on Daniel Crane, 39. Her pen hesitated mid-sentence. She wasn't writing as a judge anymore, but as a human being trying to reconcile justice and mercy. Outside her door, Captain Samuel Morgan, 46, waited quietly, hands clasped behind his back, his patience carved from years of service. For the first time since the trial began, there was no noise, no audience, only truth standing unspoken, alive within each of them. Judge Cole finally stepped out of her chambers, holding the signed papers, her last official act in this case. "Captain," she said softly, "you reminded this court that law without conscience is only order, not justice." Her voice trembled slightly, as if decades of restraint were finally breaking free. Captain Morgan gave a slow nod. "Sometimes the system doesn't need to be rebuilt, ma'am. It just needs to remember, the exchange carried no triumph, only mutual understanding." Behind them, Eli watched quietly, realizing that justice wasn't a single moment. It was an ongoing echo, living within the choices people make when no one is watching. Across town, Daniel Crane began his new work: community legal aid for those who couldn't afford representation. The small office buzzed with humility, paper stacks, a coffee pot, and people waiting in quiet hope. As he helped a trembling mother fill out a form, he caught sight of his reflection in the window, tired but unburdened. Redemption had not erased his mistakes. It had redirected his purpose. Meanwhile, Maria Reyes, 34, watched the evening news where a brief segment announced his new role. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "That's what justice looks like, not punishment, but change." Outside, the sky darkened to a calm indigo, the first stars peeking through. Small, honest lights in the distance. That night, Eli sat on the porch beside his father, the air crisp with the scent of pine and rain. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked softly. Captain Morgan turned, eyes reflecting the amber porch light. "Miss what?" "The uniform, the battles." The captain smiled faintly. "I never left the battlefield, son. It just changed its shape." A long silence followed, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the hum of wind through the trees. "You fought your first one," his father added. "And you won the only way that matters, by not becoming like them." The boy nodded, the lesson settling deeper than any verdict could. At dawn, Eli returned once more to the courthouse, not as a defendant but as a volunteer helping the clerks archive files. His reflection in the polished floor no longer showed fear. It showed resolve. He paused at the witness stand where it had all begun, tracing the grain of the wood with his fingertips. A whisper left his lips. Not a prayer, but a promise. Never again in silence. Outside, the first rays of sunlight pierced the stained glass windows, scattering colors across the empty chamber. Judge Cole's words, Crane's remorse, Ray's compassion, and his father's integrity all blended into that light. Justice at last had fallen silent, not from defeat, but from fulfillment. Years later, the courthouse stood unchanged, but the city had. The same marble steps now carried people seeking fairness, not fear. A plaque near the entrance read, "Truth is the highest rank of service, dedicated to Captain Samuel Morgan." Eli Morgan. 25 now, but still carrying 17 in his eyes, stood before it, a soft smile tugging at his lips. Behind him, Maria Reyes, 42, approached holding a file marked Community Justice Initiative. "You ready to lead your first hearing?" she asked. He nodded, adjusting his tie. "If I can face Crane, I can face anyone," she chuckled. "No! If you faced yourself, you can face anything." As they walked toward the courthouse doors, sunlight poured across the stone columns, washing them in gold, a reminder that justice endures only through those who carry it forward. Inside the courtroom, the chairs were the same, the wood the same. Only the hearts had changed. Eli, now an assistant attorney, stood before a young defendant trembling under the weight of false accusation. For a heartbeat, he saw himself years ago standing in that very spot, afraid and unheard. His voice came steady, filled with empathy rather than authority. "We don't judge the frightened, we listen to them." Judge Harriet Cole, now retired but attending as a guest, sat quietly in the back row, her silver hair now pure white, eyes shining with pride. Watching him, she realized the law hadn't just been defended. It had evolved. At the city memorial park, a new ceremony was held, the unveiling of a community center for veterans and families seeking justice support. Maria Reyes took the podium, introducing the center as the Morgan Foundation for Truth. The crowd erupted in applause as Captain Samuel Morgan, 54, stepped forward in his uniform, older now, yet the same steady light in his eyes. Eli stood beside him, clapping quietly. "You built this," Eli whispered. The captain shook his head. "No, son, you did. I only reminded you who you are." Their laughter, brief and humble, blended with the wind through the trees, a sound like closure written in nature's language. That night, as dusk fell, Eli sat by the river, where he and his father once stood years before. The city's reflection shimmered across the water, steady, forgiving. From behind, Captain Morgan joined him, no longer in uniform, just a father in quiet peace. "Do you ever think justice ends?" Eli asked. His father smiled faintly. "Justice doesn't end, son. It continues in the choices we make when no one's keeping score." They watched the ripples merge, the river's rhythm echoing the heartbeat of all they had endured. In that stillness, time seemed to bow, not to power, but to principle. Years later, a small child ran through the same courthouse corridors, Eli's daughter, laughing freely beneath the archways of justice. Her footsteps echoed like a heartbeat against marble floors once burdened by fear. Eli, now older, followed her, stopping at the witness stand. He touched it lightly, smiling at memories both heavy and holy. Captain Morgan in his twilight years entered slowly, cane in hand, his face calm and knowing. "She'll never have to stand here like you did," he said softly. Eli nodded. "Because you did, Dad." The camera lifted slowly to the stained glass windows above. Sunlight streaming through in hues of gold and blue. Justice had outlived the trial, the titles, and the noise. It had become legacy, written not in law books, but in lives.